Welcome to the second podcast in our short series on interdisciplinary teaching and learning in a higher education context. In this session, just like in our first session, we will be focusing in on the Cambridge Foundation Year as a particular case study that might tell us about broader pedagogical issues. Launched with its first cohort in September 2022, the Foundation Year is a one-year programme in the arts, humanities and social sciences. It is designed to offer a stepping stone to the University of Cambridge for talented students who have been prevented from realising their potential due to educational disadvantage or disruption. Those of us who teach on the Foundation Year seem to have developed a working thesis regarding interdisciplinary pedagogy. It is as follows: that teaching effectively in an interdisciplinary way does not entail abandoning specific disciplinary methods or agendas or practices. Quite the opposite. I think we would argue that it is fruitful for academics to teach interdisciplinary courses while rooted in the specific disciplinary perspectives they have been trained within. This working thesis I've mentioned has clear strengths, and we will discuss some of these today, no doubt. But what we've also found is that teaching an interdisciplinary course from different disciplinary perspectives nevertheless reveals a series of issues, problems, or just open questions that are worthy of time and attention. Some of the major ones arising in our Foundation Year context, for example, are: how do we ensure fair assessment processes in an interdisciplinary context, not only in setting assignments, but in marking them? How do we ensure students are properly inducted into the disciplinary norms of the degree subject that they would like to study, especially when these deviate from the disciplinary norms of their teachers? And how do we support students with gaining relevant cultural capital, the tacit knowledge and experience that often belongs to high-achieving A-level students from backgrounds and contexts where they have been encouraged in their studies? In order to discuss and answer questions like these, today I am joined by three guests, all of whom are colleagues of mine on the teaching team for the programme. Corinne Ruffley is a senior teaching associate on the Foundation Year programme, and she is our chair of examiners. And you're an archaeologist too, aren't you, Corinne?
Absolutely, but I'm not just an archaeologist. I'm an archaeologist, I suppose, by training through my undergraduate degree, but my master's degree is from the geography department, for example, because I'm a landscape archaeologist and I'm interested in lots of different ways in which people engage with space and the environment. So that requires me to know about the biological sciences, the environmental sciences, but also about philosophy and also about art. And as part of my career, I've also become a fellow of Hughes Hall, which is a college here in Cambridge which specialises in supporting people who are interested in interdisciplinary approaches. So that actually has been a really nice synergy in terms of my career development.
Yeah, so from the very beginning, an interdisciplinary academic.
Absolutely.
Well, really good to have you with us today. And my second guest is Phyllis Richardson. And Phyllis teaches on the programme, primarily on our papers featuring English literature and poetry. But you also told me, Phyllis, that you are a poster child for interdisciplinarity. So would you like to tell us a little bit about what you mean by that?
I suppose what I mean by that is I started off doing one thing, and probably similar to Warren, my degree then evolved into other things. So my first degrees were both in English literature, but my first job was in publishing, and I became a fact checker. So I had to learn about architecture, art, design, history. I was the one who had to make sure that what the journalist wrote was actually correct. And so that involved quite an education for me. And then I went on to work in publishing and journalism, where I worked on an array of publications in different sorts of areas. And yes, you have to be aware of what the priorities are of different writers whose perspectives and whose areas of expertise are special to them. I also worked on catalogs at Sotheby's, where the experts are, well, they have opinions, and so you have to do things in a way that is satisfying to them. So lots of different specialist subjects, I suppose. And then I went on to write about architecture, design, environmental design, and the last piece of substantial writing I did was a book on houses in literature, which kind of married my two subjects of architecture and English literature and some literary biography and some social history and cultural history and that sort of thing. And now I teach English on the foundation year.
I would say that very much qualifies you as a poster child. And really good to have you with us too today, Phyllis. And my final guest is Stuart Palmer, who is again a teaching associate on the foundation year. Stuart is a historian, and he specialises in the history of early modern popular politics and culture. And you're also an undergraduate admissions director, aren't you, for the arts and humanities at Murray Edwards College? So could you tell us a little bit about what that entails?
Yeah. As an admissions director, I have to think about a lot of different subjects and what those subjects are looking for in students, because trying to assess a lot of very talented students' applications for a range of different arts and humanities subjects, it's about thinking, well, how well prepared are these candidates and what are they coming into on their subjects? What do they need? So even though, I've trained as a historian, I have to think about, well, what does an economist at Cambridge need, or what does an archaeologist at Cambridge need? And that entails some engagement with disciplinary specialists in those subjects, asking them what they're looking for, but then also just doing a bit of research and I suppose empathetic thinking about what skills you need if you're coming to do an undergraduate course in something like that. But that kind of feeds into, similar to both Phyllis and Corinne, I started off in one discipline and have kind of wavered around since then. So I did my BA in history, but then my master's is in the very long-winded Renaissance and early modern studies, which in itself was designed as a sort of interdisciplinary master's course up at the University of York, and that entailed a bit of literature, a bit of history, some archaeology as well, and then actually my PhD, it's not actually in history, it's in medieval and early modern studies from another institution that set up one of those interdisciplinary programs and centres, and that's actually what my PhD technically is in. So interdisciplinarity and thinking and sort of writing in an interdisciplinary headspace has been part of what I've done really from the beginning of my time at university and since. And on the foundation year, that's served me quite nicely, I think.
Absolutely. So we've got interdisciplinarity across not only teaching and learning, but other institutional contexts among you already. So I think today, hopefully, we'll have a very fruitful conversation. We want to start bold and we want to define our terms. The first sort of questions I have is, the first thing is this the first interdisciplinary programme you've taught on?
When I finished my PhD, I taught at the same institute, so the University of Kent, where I did my PhD. I taught there at the same time and afterwards, and I taught in the Centre for Medieval and Early Modern Studies there. So that was quite interdisciplinary in what I was teaching, especially on the master's course. I took over the paleography training course that they run there from my colleague Stephen Werenen, who himself was a historian. But that was, although very skills based, I was teaching it for some people that were archaeologists, some people who needed to read paleography for very different reasons, say from those that were going into social history or something like that. So I had to sort of deliver and tweak a course which worked for all of those different audiences. So I've done a bit of sort of interdisciplinary teaching before, but then I suppose all of the teaching I've done has been in some senses interdisciplinary, but then we need to define what interdisciplinary is, I suppose.
I've taught on a multidisciplinary course before. So I actually went and taught for the master's course that I had myself done. And that was very much, I would say, multidisciplinary. We had modules using geographic information systems and remote sensing as our skill, but I was teaching the one in archaeology. And there was no overlap between what I was teaching, other than those technical things, with, for example, my colleague who was doing remote sensing of volcanoes or remote sensing of environmental change. So we were really teaching separate modules, and although there was a skills base that underpinned it all, there was no sense really that we were actually learning how these things could cross-fertilise. So I felt that I was very much teaching in a multidisciplinary environment. And actually, when I was then back teaching in my own department of archaeology, that in some ways felt more interdisciplinary, even though you might call it one academic discipline, because us archaeologists, we're always integrating different ideas from both arts and humanities and also from the sciences. So actually, although we call ourselves one discipline, what do we mean by discipline, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say, because that's actually that history of what is a discourse or a subject. And I'm thinking now a little bit about how Foucault actually helps us unpick the nature of a subject or a discourse. I think archaeology is by definition interdisciplinary, so maybe the answer to your question, Ruth, is a big yes.
You've done both. Well, we do need to define our terms, and actually, Corinne, you're helping us here, because it seems to me you're saying that on the one hand, multidisciplinarity seems to involve parallel tracks, sort of trains maybe running in the same direction but separate to one another, and so to remain almost siloed. So although students are receiving teaching and instruction from numerous different people, it doesn't mingle and intermesh, whereas the metaphor you gave for interdisciplinarity was cross-pollination, this sense of togetherness, and within the teaching context, questions asked from different perspectives, all at once. And on my right, I have Phyllis, and I know you also have some views about the distinction between interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. Do you agree with Corinne on this one?
I do, and I find myself thinking along the same lines as both Corinne and Stuart on this, because my teaching before Cambridge at Goldsmiths was on a standalone foundation year English literature program, but I worked very closely with my teaching partner, who was a historian, or is a historian, and I find that, as Corinne is saying, about archaeology, that the study of literature necessarily involves history, politics, kind of social and economic, environmental situations, and understanding those things. And we leaned heavily into the historical periods we were teaching. It was a survey course from the Renaissance up to the 20th century, and I find that it becomes, I don't see how, I know there are critics who argue otherwise, but I don't see how you can effectively help students to understand a period of literature and a style of literature without going into that historical and political context. I think that helps them out quite a lot. So I think we're always going to do that. On top of that, I was then asked to design a course that was an interdisciplinary course that could draw in history, politics, and literature. And what I set on was post-war Britain. So for the last few years, I've been working on that, trying to look at the historical events such as the miners' strike or the Cold War and things like that, drawing on what's the history of this period, what was being written about it, and what sort of literature did we get out of it. And so I find that just a natural practice, but I was able to call on colleagues to help me design this. So I wasn't doing it on my own, and I was trying to keep aware of those disciplines and their, what those colleagues were concerned that their students would learn, as you talked about those different practices.
Absolutely. So all of you seem to be advocating for the fact that in certain contexts, interdisciplinarity is an inevitability. It's a way of studying, and it needn't necessarily be labelled as such. It's just you're saying in a kind of an archaeological context, perhaps. It's just and in this sense that if you're conducting a study on a certain period or group of texts, that the questions you're asking will always come from these different disciplinary perspectives. So I think that this sounds, actually the way that we do teach on the foundation year seems to come very naturally to all of you if you're describing your teaching practice in this way. So this leads me to my next question, really, which perhaps takes us into what we might call methodology as well, because when we think about disciplines, we might think about specific kinds of methods, not only about what kinds of questions we're asking, but method, but also objects. Are we looking at objects? Are we looking at text? Are we looking at something else? And it's this really that I wanted to ask you, because I think we do all subscribe to this idea that teaching effectively in this interdisciplinary context doesn't mean abandoning those specific methods or those specific ways of asking questions that we are all sort of have been encouraged to do by our training. So interdisciplinarity isn't this kind of blancmange sort of situation where everyone's asking this, the same kinds of questions. So do you, if you agree with me on that, if you don't like the blancmange sort of model, I'd be really interested to hear your reflections on this, perhaps even with an example maybe of one of the papers you've taught. Is it fruitful for us to teach interdisciplinary courses while working from these specific, perhaps, methodologies or angles? Don't know if, Phyllis, you wanted to begin this time?
Yeah, I will speak a little bit to this because I was actually talking about this with our colleague, Cheyenne Saradorina, and we were talking about the fact that, yes, you might get the blancmange. You might end up not having students who don't have a clear idea of what the practices are that are unique to a subject that they might then go on to study. And you don't want to, in your effort to have this interdisciplinary approach, you don't want them to suffer in a lack of knowledge of those particular things that they might need to know. And I think this isn't necessarily a bad thing for our teaching because it makes us aware. We have to remind ourselves what are our practices and why. Why do we do things that way? And then we have to communicate that to students. And one of the things that Cheyenne was talking about is making explicit these sometimes arbitrary expectations or conventions that are specific to different disciplines. And so that keeps us on our toes by saying, I would say for writing, my students who are writing, this is a kind of writing we do for English literature, for an academic essay. There's a different type of writing that you need to do for journalism. There's a different kind of type of writing you would need to do as a historian. There's a different approach. This is the approach we take, and this is how we do it. And I think that helps students sometimes because it keeps them from feeling sometimes like there is something that everybody else just knows about these practices. We don't make those assumptions. We tell them.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's absolutely right. Corinne, did you have any thoughts on this question?
I think it's really fruitful, actually, to show the students, either in Phyllis's example through writing, different writing examples, but also in terms of how we approach things. So I'm thinking about how Stuart and I approach objects. We have a course on Richard III, which we run in a very interdisciplinary way, and it's been great teaching it this year with you, Ruth, as your theologian hat on, and Stuart as a historian, and obviously I'm not a medieval archaeologist, but I bring my archaeological training to it. And we start with them looking at objects. And I pick up an object and I think about what it feels like to use it, how it might have been engaged with as a real object. And so we had this knife handle, and I immediately was picking it up, and I could feel where it had been used and worn and how it fitted in my hand. And this was totally different to the way that Stuart looked at this object. I'd maybe ask Stuart to describe what he did with exactly the same object. What were you approached it completely differently to me?
I immediately noticed that this looked like a slightly cross-eyed friar. And I was immediately fascinated by the context of the object, right? And I knew a little bit about when it was from. The immediate sort of realization that this was a depiction of a late medieval friar and in a kind of satirical depiction, that was immediately what I was very much thinking about. That object's context, its sort of cultural relevance, and thinking about what it could tell us about late medieval sort of popular religion and culture, as opposed to that sort of very materially focused starting point that you had, or that more physically, that physical starting point.
So I then took Stuart's identification of this friar and realised that actually it would be hidden in my hand, and his head would actually be covered up, so that actually the satirical angle to it was something that was concealed and visible only to the person who was using it. So by putting these two things together, we actually got a much better understanding of the object, and by having that object in the room to give us a focus, we could almost like demonstrate this to the students as well. And I think that makes it much easier than trying to talk about any of these things in the abstract, because I think actually if we stay abstract, we do end up with either Foucault, which is a little bit hard for us to understand, or a blancmange.
I think you're right, and I liked Phyllis's point that you've spoken to Cheyenne about making things explicit, because that's exactly what you were both doing there. You were sort of explaining to the students why you'd both taken the route that you had, and that both of those routes are not only acceptable in themselves, but can be complementary and can lead to a sort of bigger conclusion. So I think I think that those are brilliant examples, and in fact this very nice lead into my next question, because I did want to ask you about the way that we put our papers into streams on this course. So you've been talking already, Corinne and Stuart, about the materials sources stream, but we also have a textual sources stream, a language sources and linguistic sort of learning stream, and a data stream. Do you think, the three of you, that organising the teaching like this does something good for your ability to teach in an interdisciplinary manner? I am judging that it does from what you were just saying, that you're making explicit the material as the object of study in the material sources papers. But I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about how organising the teaching in that way contributes to the way that we're able to convey successful interdisciplinary teaching to our students. I don't know who wants to go first.
Well, so I'll go first. So we were just talking about trying to make practices that are distinct or that are part of particular disciplines, making those explicit to students. But then there are those other things that are similar to, many practices or many disciplines in, say, the humanities. So one of my focuses as someone teaching literature, but I say this as teaching literature, but I'm sure this is a focus of everybody here, is teaching students about clarity of expression when they're writing, teaching students about structuring their writing, helping students to analyze texts. I teach on a textual stream, so lots of what I do with textual analysis is what Stuart will do with textual analysis in historical documents. So we share those skills across our stream, but also I think amongst the other papers that are being taught. So there are those things that follow through and are going to help students no matter what they're doing. So those parts actually work well as well, in addition to the fact that we're teaching on a textual stream, and so what we're doing is helping these students to take these skills across to other papers that they're doing. I do feel that it's appropriate to acknowledge that there are things that we're teaching them that they can carry across.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, and sometimes the students need to be reassured, don't they, of those similarities? Because when you say to the students sometimes reading this political essay or whatever is very similar to reading that poem in terms of what you're actually, the end goal of what you're doing is you're trying to read it, understand and react to it. You might need to employ slightly different language, and you might if you're writing an essay off the back of it, be again using slightly different terms. But actually the basic core skill, whether you're approaching something as a historian or as a literature scholar or as a philosopher, is clarity of expression and understanding and all of those things. It does make those conversations with students actually much easier and much more fruitful. And a colleague that you've already mentioned, Cheyenne, who I teach with on a paper looking at the history of the relationship between law and history, which is a baffling paper in many ways, but it's great fun to teach because it has forced me and Cheyenne, who is a philosopher, to really kind of grapple with that. But it means that in my previous teaching and the interdisciplinary study I've done, I've often been teaching with people who are in kind of affiliated disciplines, literature, archaeology to some extent, and now I'm teaching with a philosopher. Who, while in the humanities, does approach things in quite different ways. And there have been a couple of kind of light bulb moments, similar to the one that Corinne was describing of me and her with the knife handle, where I've really been witness to the disciplinary differences in some of the teaching, but in a very positive way. So there was a lecture that Cheyenne was delivering on social contract theory, and going through sort of the classics of social contract theory from, I think it was Hobbes, Locke, Rawls, some others. And in the entire hour, I don't think she mentioned a single date. Or like... And I can remember sitting there sort of mouth agape, thinking, my God, you can talk about things without context. This is remarkable. And afterwards, having a very sort of joyous conversation with Cheyenne about it, because although, I couldn't imagine doing a lecture where I talk about someone from the 20th century and the 17th century and the 18th century without mentioning any of the kind of context or differences between those things. She did it with such a sort of mastery and really encapsulated what, as a philosopher, she was interested, what she thought was like important, which is the core of their argument, the relationships between their different positions, and that was what it was all about. And again, that was the first year we taught the paper, and since then we've kind of harnessed that and tried to make it clear to the students that although we're asking very similar questions and we're interested in similar things, that there are these disciplinary differences in how we actually approach things, and that's something I think that the students benefit from seeing in action, whether it be in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology study room or in the lecture theatre.
Shocked face in the lecture. Yes, and Corinne, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you are the only representative among us of the data stream, so I don't know if you've got any words of wisdom on how you perhaps teach data and why it is interdisciplinary, your data teaching.
I suppose I see this coming from the way in which I've understood and defined data. So for me, data is not about teaching statistics, it's not all about quantitative analysis, it's actually about data literacy, and therefore it's just a different way of thinking about evidence. What is the evidence? What are the data that backs up this idea? What are the relevant data for the questions that you're interested in? And so actually by having to think about it in an interdisciplinary way, it means that you have to come at it from the point of view of lots of different stakeholders. So our first paper is about COVID, and it's about COVID and policy making. And actually, policy making requires you to engage with all of these different stakeholders, the people that are actually treating people on the ground, the people who are being treated, the general public who are scared of the disease, who are being made to obey regulations, the people who are writing regulations, whether the regulations are going to do what you think they're going to do, the scientists, the ministers, the MPs. You've got all of these different stakeholders, and they come with their own different perspectives, and to understand and engage with those, you actually have to take an interdisciplinary approach. I suppose you could take a multidisciplinary approach. And I wonder sometimes whether my data teaching is more multidisciplinary actually than our materials teaching. I think that the materials teaching we do is actually probably more interdisciplinary as we weave these two disciplines, three disciplines, four disciplines together more naturally, whereas from the data stream I might be saying, here's how an anthropologist would approach this. Here's an example of some ethnography where somebody's gone and done some in situ research, talking to people. This is how this research was relevant to law and policy making, how this data could be used. So I think it's more maybe the application of different disciplinary areas and also the a multidisciplinary approach. I'm not yet convinced that my data teaching is what I would define as truly interdisciplinary, other than in the obvious few examples where I'm perhaps talking about the research that I've done with Professor Anderson on demography of Scotland. There we've come from different, we are an interdisciplinary team on that. But where I'm looking at policy making, I'm not sure I'm interdisciplinary enough yet, Ruth.
Well, I mean, it is an open question as well, what is possible, because it seems to me you're talking about methodologies as well, and it's very difficult sometimes to mingle these methodological approaches, just as you were shocked, Stuart, that it's just impossible for a historian to work without dates. So in some senses, these things can be a bit like oil and water, and then we do have to think about the boundary lines and keeping those boundary lines for the sake of the student or the lecturer. So we don't necessarily have to be normative about it, do we? We can see room perhaps for multidisciplinarity in these sorts of cases.
Exactly, and I think sometimes by actually taking it in a multidisciplinary way and saying, actually, the reason this is controversial, for example, so I was doing some teaching about categorising bodies, and we were looking at how we might think about bodies in sport. Now, that's obviously a hot topic at the moment, given the current rulings from the Supreme Court and the fact that the Equality and Human Rights Commission haven't yet given their guidance on sport, but they have on changing facilities. That's a really interesting place to be for sport at the moment. That a gender studies position might take it from one perspective, a science-based natural sciences, biology, physiology might be looking at it from different perspectives. If I look at it as an anthropologist and look at how people experience and construct and perform gender, that's different. And again, from a biological anthropologist perspective, from how we've evolved, how we interact with the environment, these different perspectives and these different disciplinary discourses are perhaps part of why the discussion has become so controversial, and the fact that the Supreme Court is working within a legal discourse and is doing something that is different from what perhaps the Equality and Human Rights Commission are meant to be doing, and from what a gender studies scholar might do, or a regulatory or policy maker within the world of sport would do. I think actually understanding how these different disciplinary discourses feed in and where they clash or talk past each other is also something that's really constructive, because we don't live, I'm going to say controversially perhaps, in a fully interdisciplinary world.
Oh, absolutely not. And as you say, it's literacy, isn't it? It's one's ability to recognise the discourse in a legal context and what that discourse might be wanting to achieve, and how what it seeks to achieve would be very different to what's going on within a gender studies context. So I think that's a really, really important point, and a really valuable thing for students to be able to learn about in a sensitive space, in a space where, you know, there's lots of sharing going on. And I wanted to ask about teamwork. Because we've all been talking about what it's like to work with one another. So I thought I'd ask you for this, because the other day you were telling me how important, you know, this is music to my ears, but you said it's really important to have a well-organised and collaborative team if you're going to do the sort of teaching that we do. So could you tell me a little bit more about what was behind that thought? Was, you know, you were thinking about practices, weren't you, and sharing of practices?
Yeah, so what inspired that comment was my coming here to Cambridge from a different program that I was teaching on, coming from a place where we were trying to create an interdisciplinary module, just the one module, and the amount of work I felt was going to have to go into making that useful, just from trying to talk to my colleagues in what often gets described as the silos in academia. And so I think that having come here in a program that was set up to be an interdisciplinary program and run, okay, maybe there are issues in some of the papers and how interdisciplinary you can be effectively with the students in order to give them the best understanding of what it is you want them to be learning. But the fact that we work together and we meet regularly to talk about, we don't always discuss each other's work specifically, but I have a pretty good idea of what my students are also studying. And what's being asked of them, what kind of assessments. I know what kind of assessments that they're being asked to do. And so I'm not well-versed in archaeology, but I have a sense of, you know, the field trips that they're going on, and I know that the kinds of papers they're being asked to write. And then between the two of us, because, you know, Stuart and I teaching together, I know what Stuart's teaching in terms of the history. So when I'm talking about the poetry at the moment of the Romantic period, I can refer to some of the things that Stuart has mentioned. In the past, I've sometimes referred to something on the art paper or something on King's College Chapel, if I can work it in some way. But it's just having my understanding of what the students, what other things are being asked of them, and how those papers work together, I think helps me to deliver to them better. And then on a non-academic note, in terms of pastoral care, it is, and I think this is really important for students, as Stuart was saying. I think it's helpful for students when we can reassure them that what they're being taught in one place actually has relevance in another place. And if we can also reassure them, or we can it can help our pastoral care when we know from colleagues whether someone is struggling in one area, but yet one of us will put our hand up and say, oh, well, but on my paper they're doing very well. So we know then, okay, this student maybe we're not going to shepherd anyone from one place to another, but we know that if that person is struggling in their data paper, it doesn't mean that they're not doing well. It means they're struggling with the data paper, whereas they might be doing well on something else. And so we have an understanding of how we might then help that student to put their energies towards something that suits them. So that team, I think, is really key to that.
It's a kind of hive mind or sharing of knowledge to see a bigger picture, essentially. So we're all perhaps seeing different sides to a student come out, and the sharing across papers and across our colleagues and is helping us, well, educate them. It's helping us form a sense of what our students need, what makes them tick. And I think that's a really, really amazing observation. And I'd like to say I share your view. I think it's really important to have a good team that supports one another. And the next sort of questions I have are all about challenges. And we have been discussing a little bit of what the challenge is of interdisciplinary teaching. But I wondered if you wouldn't mind if I raised the particular challenge of assessment. Because we've been thinking about how we make explicit the particular disciplinary moves we're making with students. And I think obviously that's a massive part of preparing our students effectively for assessment. Have any of you encountered questions or difficulties, or have you wrestled with anything when you're creating the assessments that we give our students, given the interdisciplinary context?
Absolutely. So I'm going to give an example from the environment paper, because one of the things that our students are really interested in are issues of social justice. So we have a summative question, that's an essay, coursework essay of about 2,500 words, where we ask them to look at a case study and think about what data they would need, how they would collect it to decide whether a policy is just or not. And this has been a really interesting challenge, because that requires them to have some sense of a framework of justice. And the kinds of ways in which I think about justice from a sort of data literacy point of view, from the kind of environmental sciences that I've done through my geographical work, my geography basis, and the sort of social history that I've worked on with Mike Anderson, is very much pragmatic approaches. So I might be thinking about measurements and what can we measure, how we can collect data, how we can represent those whose voices are not being heard, perhaps in the written record, or who are not getting heard at the policy making table. But then I teach this, I've taught this both with Cheyenne Medina, but also now with Alex Serafimov, and they both come at it from a more philosophical point of view, and their concept of what is a good answer to that first bit of the question about justice. How do you define justice? How much work has to be gone into in terms of the justice bit that sets up what is basically a data question, is something we've actually had to sort of think about and wrestle with. So I know in the first year we weren't clear enough about this, and Cheyenne gave a really high mark to a very abstract essay, and I was like, okay, what do I do about this? And our approach as a team of examiners is, if we've not been clear enough, then we will reward how the students have interpreted it. Because it's really important that no student is disadvantaged because we haven't thought through the multi or interdisciplinarity of a question. So that's something we're really, really positive about. And I think there's that level of trust between us as a team. We can say, actually, I see this differently to you, with genuine respect and genuine trust for each other's disciplinary backgrounds. And now we've given a bit more guidance on this question, and we'll probably be reviewing it again after the latest round of marking. So it's keeping on thinking about, what does it look like from my perspective? What does it look like from yours? And I think the workshops that we have in the summer over assessment, we talk about curriculum design, we talk about what's going in, what we're going to teach, who wants to give what lectures, but we also sit down together to write these questions. And I think that's really, really important, because then, even if Cheyenne happens to not be teaching that paper that year, she can go, I can see there's a possible other way of looking at this. If students have done my paper on education policy, they'll have done a lot about different concepts of justice, and so they'll be thinking about this in a different way to you. So again, I think it's that collaboration actually helps us, the collaboration that Phyllis was describing, helps us with assessment, and that trust within the team means it actually works. Whereas I think if we were all living in our own silos rather than collaboratively teaching and meeting regularly, it would be much harder to mark effectively and to provide guidance.
Absolutely. And I think you're right that your points and Phyllis' points go very well together, because we've got that same sense of anticipation. I can anticipate now how Corinne might respond to one of the questions I draft, or Cheyenne might respond, because we've got to know each other, and we've also, through getting to know each other, we've learnt about the disciplinary perspectives that we take. And you're right, something like justice might leap out for a more philosophical thinker, whereas it might not for someone else. So I think these make complete sense to me. I share your perspectives. Stuart, was there anything you wanted to bring up in terms of either challenges in general or in terms of the assessment and marking that Corinne's just mentioned?
I mean, I think reiterating this idea that our teaching team, the nature of the teaching team and the makeup of the teaching team is both a blessing and at times a bit of a curse, but that curse actually comes all the way back round to a blessing.
People can't see Corinne's face at the moment when you said I think they should be able to.
But certainly, I mean, from a personal point of view, right, working with the makeup that we have on our teaching team, which is quite small, there's 7 of us, across a range of different disciplines, means that I've been exposed to different ways of writing, different ways of thinking, and very much different ways of marking assessments and kind of valuing different things in written work, which has been very eye-opening and very positive in many ways, but has also required lots of collaboration, discussion, and working through with colleagues. So whether that's about discussing whether or not you can make an argument just by doing sort of writing about a chronology and like presenting kind of like a historical chronology, is that actually an argument? As a historian, I would say yes, but I've had to convince others that actually you need to be more who think you need to be more explicit and a bit more analytical with what you do. But these conversations have been wildly fruitful and made me think much more actively about my own discipline and what a historical argument actually is and what it requires when compared to an argument made even in an affiliated subject like English literature. So yeah, I think it's blessing, curse, all those things.
Absolutely. And off the back of that, I want to ask you all, has teaching together changed the way that you think, or the way that you oh, we've got lots of nods. So who wants to go first? Corinne, do you want to go first?
Oh, okay. I have loved working on the materials paper and thinking about it from a more theologically informed perspective. So many of the things that I've learned from working with Stuart and Ruth on these papers have made me think differently about how I approach both space, about concepts of particularly the Reformation, the impact that has on, for example, King's College Chapel, how I bring my own perspectives as somebody who's really interested in space and interactions, but actually I don't necessarily think about it with the lens that you've brought, and yet I can also see, that's a source that I've read, but I've read it totally differently from you. And I'll go back to that reading then in that long summer holiday, which is far too short to do all of these things, and try and see it now with a new eye. And I think that's been really transformational in terms of my own understanding of material I thought I was familiar with, as well as making me more sensitive to the things that maybe I'm not so good on. So there are these, trying to remember some dates, Stuart. I'll try and remember the dates.
Monarchs. The succession of monarchs you've always struggled with.
I know, I'm never going to get there on that one. It's still always going to be a Stuart question when a particular king died.
Well, you are very upfront about that with the students as well, aren't you? If they're struggling, you're saying, I understand.
I think that humility is something that this course has also taught us in many ways, right? Like being constantly sort of in awe of one's colleagues and their own specialisms and knowledge is actually a really nice part of our teaching, and it means that we get to hear and see lots of very interesting different approaches to topics that we may think we once knew something about, and that's been something that has been a real feature of it, of teaching on this program and with this team. I think in terms of changing my own practice, it's certainly made me think more kind of in the round about how I approach a specific topic and not get hyper focused on context and that kind of chronology as one can do in history teaching. It's been good fun in that way. But I think that's helped in many aspects of both my teaching and in my research and elsewhere.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what Corin and Stuart have just been saying. And when I get a tough question from one of my students, I can just say, "Oh, you can ask Stuart that," which is quite useful. I go, "Oh, maybe Ruth can answer that question for you." So
it's true.
It's great for being able to refer students because they're the experts. I can do that. Definitely has made me reflect on my own practice. Definitely, sometimes just hearing about how one of you might be teaching something or approaching something, and I'll think about, oh, that's an idea. I might try something along those lines, or just standing back. I know when Corin was talking about assessments, I was having a little nod there as well, because I remember a particular essay where I was really not very impressed with what this student did, and it was referred to another marker who, from one of the other papers, who could see what the student was doing that was very good in terms of the that other discipline, and found it worth higher marks than what I was going to give it. And quite apart from having the reassurance and as Corin said, just the absolute respect for your colleagues and their knowledge, and being able to feel like you can agree with them about changing a mark that you've given without feeling like you are just not doing your job. You are actually doing your job because you are taking advice on something and someone is reading something differently, and I respect that person, so I'm happy to do that. So that's I think an absolutely worthwhile exercise. But then it also made me stand back and think, okay, what is it I'm expecting from the students in their writing in this assessment? What do I feel they need to achieve, and why do I feel particularly like this wasn't achieved, and is that really important, or do I need to kind of maybe think again about what I think needs to be expressed and what I think a student needs to demonstrate, and how I feel, what I feel is fair in marking that. So absolutely makes me think about my own practice, reflecting on my teaching, assessment, all those things.
Wonderful. And what's also apparent to me is that all of you have learned a lot about why you do it the way that you do as well, because if you have to explain why you go about something to something else, you end up interrogating the assumptions that you've often, if we've been teaching for years, you carry them at some point. They're not active practices anymore, they're sort of settled. And so I think it is a really good exercise to have to reflect on, why do I do it the way I do it? Is this defensible, or are there other ways of doing it? And the other thing I was thinking of while you were all talking is, of course, what I've learned from you all. And one of the biggest things I've got from this course is the material sources teaching. And I think, Corin, you've told me that you've genuinely seen me think differently and teach differently in our third year, because when we first started, Corin and I, with Stuart's expert help and guidance, run the paper on King's College Chapel. And the first time we went into the chapel together, I could just feel the way that Corin was looking at things just differently to the way I was. And I'm very much in my training a texts person. And to learn how to read a place or a building or an object is something, it's not like reading a text. There's very specific things one has to do. And you also have to be aware of your own body and your own positionality. I've learnt so much being forced to think about objects as a different conceptual category, and I think it's been really sort of revelationary. It's the same thing that happened to me. You know, I had the historian conversion, Stuart, when I went to CRASSH, and I had to learn how to talk to historians and classicists, and suddenly I had to know what dates were and whether ideas were born in particular periods. And it was, again, that was revelation to me, and context became so important. So it does rub off on you, doesn't it? Working with others and seeing how they think, and you get ideas and you pinch them, and you think, maybe I can sprinkle a little bit about, you know, what Stuart's doing into my own practice, or maybe Phyllis's idea on this is how I should be thinking. So it's a joy, isn't it? It's really a really wonderful environment. And on the back of that, if we were pitching the foundation to someone and we were talking about interdisciplinarity as something that is a good thing, what springs to mind as the positives, the real benefits or exciting aspects to teaching in an interdisciplinary way, do you think?
Well, I think it makes me think of what Karen was saying before about the paper where you were talking about the sports paper and all the different disciplines and the way people were approaching it differently, and how life isn't interdisciplinary, I think is what you said. And I think that we are setting students up, well, if this works the way we would like it to, we are setting students up to have that vision where to understand, okay, life isn't, academic subjects are not, but if you can understand that and you can have that lateral thinking yourself and make those connections yourself, then you can be not only just a flexible sort of in your education, but you can be adaptive, and you will maybe not be so surprised when you go into a particular discipline and realize that there are strategies and practices and expectations within that discipline. You'll be aware that that exists. And I think that's a good thing for students. I know that students in our program will go on to a single subject, but they will go into that subject with the knowledge that there are these practices and expectations of that subject, and that they will need to learn those, and that is not a bad thing. That is a fact of any discipline that you want to learn. It's not something to be worried about in terms of not having the knowledge already.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anyone want to add to what Phyllis has just said?
I think we convey through our own experiences of learning interdisciplinarity an enthusiasm for thinking creatively. And I think that's imaginative, I'm going to even say potentially borderline original thinking. And I think that that's something that our students really thrive on, because they've chosen to come on this course because they are interested in ideas, they're interested in the ways in which ideas interact with texts, with materials, with languages, with data even possibly. And they are interested in these interplays and how things work. And I do think that by demonstrating interdisciplinarity, and also where interdisciplinarity breaks down into multidisciplinarity or simply monolithic silos, we help them to think more creatively about the future. And I think we see that on the art paper as well, actually, where we see art as material, as stuff, but we also see how it plays out in different environments, how it's curated, its reception history, how it's written about, how it's understood. And that helps them develop as individuals and become more creative and gives them space to be imaginative. And I do think that actually interdisciplinarity is at least as effective as multidisciplinarity at helping students find their home. Yes. So I'm thinking of those students who have come along thinking they wanted to do one course and actually ended up doing something completely different, but they can see how it is not completely divorced from other things that they might want to go on and do in their lives. And I think if we just taught in silos, in multidisciplinary silos, then it would be actually harder to perhaps see the relevance of a degree in art history for a lawyer, for example, or a degree in classics for a solicitor. And I think that does help people understand that the world is not just in silos, because they can see this, and then it gives them maybe the confidence to do something that they're going to really love doing for the next 3 years of their lives, rather than feeling that they just have to do it. And I think we see that. And I think that is part of being interdisciplinary and creative and imaginative and giving space for new ideas and flexibility.
It sometimes takes some persuasion, doesn't it, with the students to get them on board with that. But I think students, everywhere I've taught, regardless of what course they're coming onto, often have an idea of themselves when they start, and either what they want to be doing at university or what they're aiming to do afterwards. So an interdisciplinary course, I think sometimes, such as this, for students can initially be a bit frustrating because they want to get to where they want to go, and they think, I don't want to know about this knife handle. I want to.
Why am I having to do some archaeology? Yeah, exactly. I got taught that. Why is this paper not more about history?
Yeah, but it does, I mean, I think in the 3 years we've been delivering it, we've seen for almost all of the students that they settle into it. And although at the start of the year, when we have to explain why social scientists use in-text citations and why humanities people don't use footnotes, you can kind of feel the room rolling their eyes. They do eventually kind of start to see some of the benefits of interdisciplinarity, that rather than having to learn all of these different disciplinary norms that they're just going to jettison next year anyway. But yeah, that's one of the fun parts, certainly.
Oh, you've all sold it to me. I think we do. I think interdisciplinarity is a very positive thing, and we have one more question. I've got one question on my list, and it's: have there been things that have surprised you about the way that our cohorts, the way that our students have responded to this interdisciplinary environment?
This is a really tough one, because I think many of the things we could have predicted, the people who think that they want to just do one discipline and get frustrated. But I think it's that moment when somebody goes, actually, that's really exciting. I hadn't thought of it like that. And I was not convinced necessarily that we would see that. So I think the number of times we see students making connections. I mean, the first student surprised me before we even started teaching. And we were talking about what subjects, what do you want to do, what papers are you going to choose? And she said to me, I'm going to do the body and art, and I'm going to do sport, because I'm fundamentally interested in questions of how we think about our bodies. And these are both questions about bodies. They're not about data versus material. These are about identities, bodies, and ways in which our bodies exist in space, are portrayed in space, and culture, and how gender identity is performed, expressed, how other aspects of our being interacts with our surroundings. And I thought, wow, that is such a surprising response. Now, having taught both papers, she's absolutely right. But it was quite surprising to have a student realise that before me.
Yeah, the way that they were grouping the papers together didn't seem to fit with your impression of how they would work.
They were different streams, and I was still wrestling with this idea that whether the streams were a good idea or not and how they might work out. So this student was way ahead of me, and I think that was a very, very pleasant surprise.
That's lovely.
Yeah, I suppose that's nice as well, because the streams can make it sound like we're quite multidisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary, but that student has thankfully helped challenge that by show some of the ways that we cross over these. Yeah, I think the students generally, their ability to adapt across the papers has surprised me pleasantly. I mean, again, it's sort of what we hope to see. But students that can, in one term, say, do a language in a data paper and think very much in about how to analyse and process data and think about linguistics and all these things, and the next term go on to study the phenomenology and King's College Chapel and do this successfully, given that we're a level 4 course. Like, I think that's been really encouraging and fun to witness, and it sort of provides, as Corinne alluded to earlier, opportunities for students to think about other things they might want to go on to study, next, rather than necessarily what they came onto the course thinking about. And I think that's one of the big values of the course, actually, because as in my previous roles and current role as an admissions tutor, or as like an outreach practitioner, you often tell A-level students, you might not have thought about doing archaeology or history of art or Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic, but why not explore them? But actually, exploring these things in that context on your own without some guidance is incredibly challenging. And I think that are some of the issues for progression of students onto those subjects. So the foundation year kind of gives us a little tool to help students explore some of those smaller subjects that are, wildly valuable, but are quite hard to access when you are 16 or 17 and have very limited resource.
You're absolutely right. And you speaking about the adaptability of our students is pretty amazing, isn't it? Because they're not just taking one cookie cutter and saying, oh, I'll do a bit of this and I'll do a bit of this, and it's always the same shape. They're genuinely being transformed in every different paper to the demands and the objectives of that particular paper and what it wants from them. So, when I teach someone on my textual papers and then I send them to Corinne and they do data, and we both think, wow, the student's really grappling with the exercise that I'm asking of them. It is very striking, isn't it? It speaks to their adaptability and also their perception, their ability to see what's required of them and to move accordingly, which bodes very well for their future academic careers if they can manage it. Thank you all so much for joining me today and talking about our favourite thing. One of our favourite things. I don't think teaching is necessarily all of our favourite top things, but it's up there. I hope those of you who are listening have enjoyed this session today. Please look out for other sessions in this podcast series. And if you're interested in the foundation year, you can find it on the Cambridge University website.